Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting the broadcast shortly with today's webinar. We'll just wait for other people to join, and we'll be starting in about 2 minutes.
Eric, I have my video on. Oh, let's hold on. Can you guys hear me? You can? All right.
So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, MSP Security 101, how to protect your MSP from attack and keep the reputation of your clients. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So I'd like to introduce you to today's panel and presenters. We have Eric Rockwell, CEO of Instock, who used to own an MSP and a very successful MSSP in Southern California. We have Dave Watts, who is also CFO of Instock and previous president of NetFusion, again, a very highly successful MSP in LA, and Miles Keogh, CEO of Spade Technology based in Boston. The structure of today's webinar, we're going to start off with a presentation from Eric around the main points of how to protect your MSP with the framework that you can work to, and then we will move on to a Q&A with today's panel. So I'll hand over to Eric, and we hope you enjoy.
All right. Hello, everyone.
Morning.
So, morning again. Morning for us here in the beautiful city of Los Angeles, city of angels. Anyway, what we're going to be talking about today, fairly briefly, is how to use the top 20 critical security controls as defined by the U.S. Center for Internet Security to protect your MSP, specifically the tools and systems that you use to communicate with your clients, your PSA system, your RMM tools, other places that you might store client information like email. We're going to talk about how to use these critical security controls to protect your MSP. And we're not going to be talking about all 20 of them. We're going to specifically be talking about the top 6 today. The top 6 are statistically the most important. One thing that we wanted to point out, as some of you may know, MSP attacks are on the rise. We've talked to a number of MSPs that have suffered ridiculous breaches, some MSPs who had to pay millions of dollars in ransomware because an attacker, a cyber criminal, compromised them and used them as a launch pad to get into their clients. Pretty scary situation. Here's kind of the amazing thing. These cyber criminals, they've gotten more organized than us. So instead of competing with each other, they've become the new organized crime family. And one of the amazing things about that is if you take a look at previous crime or organized crime, the largest bank heist in U.S. history was $30 million. And right now, last year, cyber criminals stole $114 billion in cash from the U.S., and that totaled globally $445 billion, not just in the money that was stolen, but in the time that it took to recover from those breaches. So we're talking about numbers that are exponentially higher than previous organized crime families were able to generate, or other types of criminals were able to generate by robbing banks or stagecoaches or anything else in history. Pretty crazy time. This slide shows the number of individual records breached just in the U.S. going back to the year 2000. And as we can see, this has been getting worse and worse. And last year, we topped 2.5 billion individual records breached. 2.5 billion breaches. This problem is skyrocketing. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. And that $114 billion in cash in the U.S. cost $274 billion in time to recover. So think about all the doctor's offices and law firms and CPA firms and other types of professionals that bill for their time. It costs more than twice the amount of money that was stolen, like in a ransomware attack or in a money wiring scheme, to recover than it did to actually pay out the cyber criminal. If this trend continues, we're going to see this number double, and some experts actually say that it's going to hit $1 trillion by 2021.
Eric, I'd like to make a point on something. You're talking about the time it took to recover for those firms. Imagine if it were your MSP. I think it's going to be kind of an all or nothing if you get attacked. It's not going to be like, oh, I've got one client that's now been compromised. You could have all of your clients compromised at once. And imagine that amount of time for you trying to go out and trying to recover all of your clients at once.
Yeah, crazy. The other thing that I've noticed with some of these breaches is that the MSPs did not have a good security incident response policy, and they kind of handled the attack kind of ad hoc, and they didn't know who to notify. They also didn't actually prep their team. So once word got out and the media started contacting their techs that were listed on LinkedIn, they were able to get one or more of them to talk and just kind of disclose information that was really embarrassing to the MSP. So it's also important to have an incident response policy and train your team on what not to do during a breach, as well as what to do. Anyway, the amazing thing here is that these top critical security controls would have prevented 85% of those 2.5 billion breaches last year. So we're going to be talking about those top 6 controls today. And they're all things that MSPs are capable of doing. They're just usually not done. And some of them are not very intuitive, but they're actually fairly simple. They're just not thought of. And by the way, for those of you who are familiar with multi-factor or two-factor authentication, for privileged accounts, we're going to talk about that today. That's in the top 4. But for standard user accounts, that's actually number 16. It's not in the top 6. So these are the questions that are addressed by the top 6 critical security controls that we believe every MSP needs to be able to answer and say yes to. How would you know if a bad actor, if a cyber criminal, logged into your email from a computer in Russia? What would they read about your clients in your email? What client information or confidential information is located in your sent items? If someone phished your PSA or RMM password, how would you know that? How would you know if your PSA or RMM servers are actually being attacked? How would you know if somebody's poking at the door and trying to break into them every day? Or how would you know if they've already been breached? The average time it takes for a cyber criminal to breach an environment like this and launch their attack is 200 days. So typically these attacks are not launched immediately after a break-in. A lot of times these cyber criminals who are highly organized will create multiple backdoors once they've gotten in and start to own the environment. And once they get to a certain point, they will sell the access to that environment to another cyber criminal who specializes in attacking that type of company. So how would you know if a cyber criminal is doing reconnaissance scans on your RMM tool? How would you know if somebody copied your most sensitive data from your cloud? If an employee was sending information out of your network without authorization, how would you know? How would you know if a personally owned computer or a client-owned computer with malware was on your private network and was attacking the rest of your computers? How would you know if an old IT person or an old employee still has access somehow? How would you know if another MSP's tools are still on your client's networks and they have access, like the former MSP? How would you know if somebody logged in as you in two places at once? So these are the questions that we're going to be addressing today. And all of this comes from something called the NIST Cyber Security Framework. A lot of these security controls exist in other frameworks like ISO. They've just been specifically prioritized by a $2 billion investment that the US government made. And this investment analyzed the root cause of all of these billions of breaches and came up with this framework, which is partly proactive, partly reactive. And we're going to be talking mostly about the proactive side. One of the things that we find is that a lot of MSPs have great detection tools set up, but because they haven't taken the time to identify what is allowed in their business environment, where people are allowed to work remotely from, things like that, the detection tools are only partially effective because they are not detecting or alerting things that lead directly to breaches. Or they are detecting them and they're just getting lost in the noise. So the U.S. Center for Internet Security is a nonprofit organization. This is something that started in the U.S. SANS Institute and spun off from the SANS Institute. And they would have a very close partnership with NIST. And what they've done is they've defined the top 20 security controls from NIST. So there's hundreds and hundreds of security controls in NIST. They have defined the top 20 that are statistically the most effective and would have prevented up to 98% of those breaches in the U.S. over the last 2 years. And the top 6 account for 85% of those. And we're going to be doing a deep dive on the top 6 and actually taking some real redacted screenshots and showing them from real MSPs and showing how cyber criminals were attacking them and how these critical security controls help spot and prevent the breach. So we're going to dive right into critical security control number 1. A lot of people, a lot of MSPs that we talk to, they think that something like multi-factor authentication would be the most important security control. It's not. It is important, but these controls layer on top of each other, and they address statistically real breaches that have actually happened. And the number one cause, the number one critical security control over the last 7 years has not been multi-factor authentication. It's actually been having an inventory of what devices are actually allowed to be on your network and connect to and touch your data, and being able to alert on or prevent unauthorized devices from having access to that data. This comes way before multi-factor authentication. So part of critical security control 1 is only allowing authorized and hardened assets on your networks. This means preventing client-owned machines that might have malware or personally owned devices, even from employees, from being on the network. and having a way to inventory and control them. Some of this can be done through your existing RMM and PSA tools, and some of this can be accomplished through an asset inventory control system. This is an example of the one that InSoc provides. But as you can see here, we have a way to capture every data packet on the production networks and capture every log that comes out of clouds like Amazon and Microsoft 365. So we can identify what devices are connecting and actually select whether or not they're approved and authorized. And if they're unapproved, we can alert on them, so you will actually know if a new device or an unapproved device is on your network or connecting to your cloud resources. Think about what's in scope for this. It's your remote access service, your RMM tool, your PSA, email, document sharing like SharePoint or OneDrive, chat and instant message like Microsoft Teams or Slack, your configuration management database like IT Glue, backup storage like Datto, anything else that you might be hosting in the cloud. This critical security control applies to everything. You have to have a way to inventory and control what hardware assets are allowed to be on your networks and touch your data.
Eric, one of the things I found with my MSP is that we would have policies and procedures in place, such as don't put, because we would have clients' machines courier to us if we couldn't fix them remotely. And we had a policy and procedure, only put this on, we had a separate VLAN for that, et cetera. But the problem is you could have all the policies and procedures in the world, and the weak link is someone just like plugs it in the first LAN port they see, or the first Wi-Fi thing that's easy because they know the password for it, and suddenly they're on the production network. So it wasn't until I implemented this control that I was able to actually detect on that.
Yeah, and we've got we've got some horror stories. We've seen breaches where an employee who had an admin account was actually logging into their MSP issued laptop with the domain admin account, and they were taking it home every day and doing stuff they shouldn't be doing on the internet and bringing it back into the office, and that's how the bad guys got in. We've seen other employees do that with personally owned devices, not because they thought they were doing something bad, but because they had the Wi-Fi password, they liked using their personal computer better for some reason. This just goes back to the number one way to prevent that. Make sure that only authorized and controlled devices are on your network and touching your data. By the way, part of Critical Security Control 4 is making sure that only authorized devices that don't have access to internet and email that might have harmful content on them are being used to manage your client's networks. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So Critical Security Control 2 is around inventorying the software that is allowed in your environment. And one of the number one risks that we see in MSPs has to do with remote access software and defining what your authorized method, your authorized remote access software is. This is an example of a real MSP that had remote desktop open, and we can see a known bad actor in Russia trying to log in. So how would you know if an unauthorized method of remote access is happening? So one of the other things that we commonly find is that a free remote access program like TeamViewer or something like that was installed by a current or former employee because they were trying to do their job and they didn't realize there might be a risk and everybody forgot about it. And when we onboard a new client, whether it's the MSP or one of the MSP's clients, we typically find 3 to 5 unauthorized remote access programs running all over the place and real cyber criminals hammering them every day trying to break in. So think about MFA. Even if you have MFA turned on everywhere that you know about, what about technologies like this that you don't know about? How would you detect a free remote access service like TeamViewer that can be run from a website that does not require administrative privileges to run? It completely bypasses everything. take this a little bit further, how would you know if a bad actor actually logged into your computer or your email from a computer in Russia? Just as an example. We're not saying that Russia has the most cyber criminals, but there are a lot of malware-infected systems in Russia that cyber criminals use to remotely launch attacks. So a lot of these attacks come from Eastern Europe, Russia, and Asia. So think about this. If you have multi-factor authentication turned on in Microsoft 365, have you closed other holes that might be open, like legacy access? Well, what does legacy access do? It's turned on by default. Legacy access provides access to devices that don't support MFA. Most of these cyber criminals that breach Office 365, they're not using Office 365's version of Outlook. They're not using Outlook 2019. They're using Outlook 2010, which can use legacy access, bypass the MFA, and create rules like email forwarding rules that you can't see in Microsoft 365 because it's legacy. So think about what's in scope for this. And by the way, this pertains to multiple critical security controls 2, 6, and 12. This is about defining not just what methods of remote access are authorized, but defining where people are allowed to log in remotely from. Do any of your employees work remotely from Russia? If no, you should probably make sure that nobody can get into IT glue or your configuration management database or your backup storage cloud or your PSA or your RMM from a computer in Russia. So the next critical security control, number 3, has to do with vulnerability management. How would you know if a known vulnerability is exposed? So this is one of the other things that we do at INSOC is we help identify known vulnerabilities both from the inside and the outside. From the inside, because we're protecting against potentially unauthorized, personally owned devices that might be on the network and have malware and could directly attack a vulnerability. And of course, from the outside, because anyone can attack a vulnerability from the outside. And these vulnerabilities are actually scored by NIST every day from 0 to 10. And we know that if it's an 8, 9, or 10 level vulnerability, we need to work with the MSP to remediate it that day, versus if it's a 1 or a 2, it's not very important and it can be reviewed and deprioritized. So how do you know what vulnerabilities are exposed on your PSA tool? Well, this is a real screenshot. This is a real example of a PSA tool like, let's say, ConnectWise Manage that had a legacy rule on the firewall with port 80 open. And this particular PSA was getting attacked by a known DDoS attacker in South Korea 1.5 million times a day. I mean, this is crazy. Just look at the date and timestamps on this example. It's like a machine gun just going a few seconds apart, trying to break into this LabTech server. So part of what Critical Security Control 6 talks about is, now that you know about this, how do you alert on it? How do you know that a known bad actor is targeting you? How do you know that they're trying to break in? Part of Critical Security Control 9 is knowing what insecure ports, protocols, and services are actually being used in your environment so that you can do something about it. And if port 80 is critical, maybe it needs to be protected with an access list or a VPN. And part of Critical Security Control 19 is, if you have already been breached, what do you do? How do you respond? How do you do it in an orderly fashion so that it's not chaotic? And how do you know and make sure that you've covered all your bases? And how do you prove the extent of the breach? How do you know that the cyber criminal isn't in further than you think they are? And again, everything is in scope here. Your remote access service, your RMM, your PSA, your email, your document sharing, your chat, your IM, your configuration management system, your backup and storage, your cloud hosting. So here's another interesting part of critical security controls 4, 6, and 16. How would you know if somebody is logged in as you in 2 places at once? Or if you have MFA enabled, how would you get alerted if somebody logged in and the MFA failed? This happened to one of our MSP clients a couple of weeks ago. They have a client with INSOC who's a U.S. defense contractor, and they have an employee who's been there for like 20 years who is all over LinkedIn. They get lots of phishing attacks and things like that. Well, a cyber criminal was able to successfully phish this executive's password, and we got alerted that they logged into Office 365 from a computer in Dubai, but the MFA failed. The user was smart enough to look at their phone and hit decline, but they never reported it. They never said anything. If we hadn't known that, then he never would have reported or known that his password was compromised. And we were able to respond, make sure the cyber criminal was flushed out, prove the extent of the breach, prove that the cyber criminal didn't compromise anything, and make sure that that user's password was immediately reset globally.
Okay. One point on that, Eric. I think it's, some people might say, oh, well, the MFA worked because it prevented them from logging in, but it actually confirmed for them that the password was correct. And then they could start trying to attack other systems with the same credentials.
Bingo. And they're going to keep trying to phish that user because they know they're vulnerable. And not just them, they're going to sell that information to their other cyber criminal buddies. And that may or may not show up on the dark web for weeks or months. It may not show up at all. Great point, Dave. So part of Critical Security Control 4 has to do with how you use privileged accounts. So one thing that we commonly see that's very dangerous is that MSPs are using default privileged usernames like administrator, admin, and root. And typically when we onboard a new MSP, one of the first things that we see is that their administrator account is getting attacked hundreds or thousands of times a day. So this security control is pretty straightforward. Do not use any default username. It is also a part of this control not to have shared accounts and to have multi-factor authentication enabled on all privileged accounts. But most basically, don't use any privileged usernames. Administrator, admin, root, zadmin. There's a whole bunch of them, and these all need to be confirmed to be disabled and not used. So in this screenshot, this was an MSP that we onboarded a few weeks ago, and day one, we saw over 1,000 invalid login attempts from the username administrator. How would you know if a known cyber criminal was doing reconnaissance scans on your RMM or PSA or firewall? INSOC accomplishes this through a technology called Network Deep Packet Inspection. And one of the cool things here is that we can see when a cyber criminal is trying to log in using something like MySQL or remote desktop protocol, even if it's not on the default port. It doesn't matter what port it's on. We see remote desktop attacks from port 443 every day because of known vulnerabilities. And if we look at this example, we can see bad actors scanning for all the common insecure ports, protocols, and services that might be exposed. LDAP, remote desktop, MySQL, 80, HTTPS, SSH, Telnet. So part of what we want to do is identify reconnaissance being done by cyber criminals and block them. We want your MSP to be invisible to the world. So we've talked a lot about protecting your MSP. There is good news. Not only can you protect your MSP, you can make a lot of money doing it because your clients probably want you to do the same thing. And there are fairly inexpensive ways to accomplish these different security controls. And you can heavily monetize it, more than double your money. And just as kind of a simple math exercise, Dave, what was kind of an approximate number of assets that your MSP was managing? Probably a few thousand at least?
Yeah, probably a little bit over 2,000.
Do you think that if you still had your MSP, you could approach your clients with these critical security controls and maybe get an extra $25 a month per user for preventing these cyber attacks?
I think it'd be pretty easy to, and I actually think that if I didn't do it, somebody else would come in and offer it probably.
Yeah, that's another great point that we'll have to come back to. I was just doing some simple math, and I'm not a math expert, Dave, but I'm pretty sure that if you have 2,000 endpoints and you're charging $25 a month per user or endpoint for managed security services, that's $50,000 a month in recurring revenue.
Yeah.
And even if you only capture half of that, that's 25 grand a month that's just sitting on the table. And going back to your point earlier, a lot of the MSPs that we're working with now, they before they were working with us, they had one or two clients that actually got breached, and those clients ended up hiring a real managed security provider or cybersecurity firm to come in and conduct a forensic investigation of the breach because they didn't have any of these log management tools in place. They couldn't prove the extent of the breach. And in all of these situations, the cybersecurity firm that came in said, wow, this MSP looks like they're not doing anything. Look at all these security controls that are not in place. You should talk to this trusted MSP that we work with. So in some cases, they lost the clients completely. In other cases, they had a MSSP come in and start managing the client, and everything went sideways and went from being a profitable deal to being in the hole.
I think there's one more thing. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to add, commenting on your point.
I was going to add that you talked about leaving 2,000 endpoints, $50,000 of MRR on the table. Again, I think you almost have to do it to prevent someone else from coming in and taking away your client. But it also, another positive point is that it also, if you are actually implementing these controls, then you're actually going to be showing your client things that need to be changed in their environment, and you're going to generate a lot of additional NRR or project work for these after you get these in place. And then if you have a regular frequency with meeting with them, then it's going to be a very easy sale.
Totally agree. So you're telling me that option one is to make more money, gain more respect, look like a hero, and help your clients prevent breaches. And option two is to get breached and possibly get fired.
Yeah, which one should I do?
Yeah, it sounds funny when you put it that way. And Dave, even if, let's say, that you're only able to capture half of that MRR, like 25 grand a month, how hard was it for you when you had your MSP to get $25,000 a month in new MRR?
Very difficult. And I think that this is probably stickier MRR it's gonna cement your existing relationship with the client. Whereas if you don't do it, like you said, someone else is going to come in behind you, and it's going to be very easy to dislodge or upset your existing relationship with your client.
Totally agree. Let's say that what was your average size client, Dave?
5,000.
And that was you're probably charging around $200 a month or $175 a month per user. So you probably had like 25 to 30 users.
Yeah, we were probably closer to probably between, let's say 175 is easy for math.
So let's say 28 users then, and times that by the $25 a month, which you're basically doubling your money on. That's $700 a month. You're telling me how many of those $5,000 a month clients do not have potential breaches that would cost less than $700 a month?
Zero. That's a really good way to put it.
Right. I mean, let's say that's 85 grand a year. Most of these breaches would probably cost you and them more than 8,500 bucks. Sorry, 8,500 bucks a year.
Yeah, it would be impossible probably to have one that would cost less.
Totally agree.
Especially when you factor in lost time for the client.
Exactly. So part of what we've done at InSoc is focus on the top 6 critical security controls with our offerings, both identification, protection, and detection. We help you take your MSP and then your clients through a very basic information security policy workshop and planning session so we can identify what the policies are. That's the governance, knowing what's allowed and what's not allowed. And we end up approaching things from all 3 of the CIS implementation groups. These are predefined ways defined by the Center for Internet Security of implementing some, half, or all of these critical security controls in an orderly fashion. We're going to do another webinar on that in the future. I just wanted to point out that there is kind of a low, medium, high way to introduce security to your clients. And we work with all 3 approaches. Dave, what are some common objections to having managed security in place?
Well, I don't have any. I don't see it on here, but one of the ones I hear is, well, we don't have any information that anybody would want.
Oh my God, that's a really good one. That probably should be on here. Part of that comes from taking your clients through an exercise to just identify what a cyber criminal would do. You're telling me, so if a cyber criminal logged into your email, Mr. CEO or CFO, and they sent wiring instructions or they read through your email, could they get in the middle of a financial transaction? Quite possibly.
I definitely also hear we don't have the budget.
Right. I mean, I think we addressed that. You don't have $8,400 a year to prevent an attack. You're telling me that every possible cyber attack that you've heard about in the news would cost your company less than $8,400 a year. And if that's true, if it's a dry cleaner on the corner, then it's probably not a good MSP client or MSSP client. But most doctors' offices, law firms, CPA firms, manufacturing companies, any common breach would cost exponentially more than $8,400. So it's worth preventing. It's definitely worth trying to prevent 85% of them. Can you talk a little bit about how that's added value for your previous customers, Dave?
Well, the security, you mean adding the security controls?
Yes.
Yes. So clients want to have this information. They want to feel protected. Someone's marketing for you all the time, and it's called the news. And all they have to do is like turn on the news any day, any source, and you're going to see breach after breach after breach. All right. So that the value for the customer is they need to know that they can actually function. They can be aware of anything that's happening in their environment. They can reduce the maximum number of threats with the least amount of money spent. And if you implement like those top 6 security controls, you are actually preventing, I believe it's like 85% of all known breaches reported in the prior year. And if you were even ambitious enough to do the rest of them, I think you can get up to like 96% or something. But
yeah, up to
clients,
98.
Yeah, clients want to know what's going on in their environment. Just like a client wants to know what their employee is doing, they want to know what is happening on their network, in their cloud resources, et cetera. And that's another one that I see that you have written down there, though, is a lot of people think that the cloud is going to be this cure-all panacea, and it is not. If anything else, it actually might make it more complicated.
Oh, totally. We were doing a sales call with an MSP prospect, so an MSP that we work with, one of their clients a few months ago, and we were talking to the CFO of this really good-sized company in Houston, and we were going through this, and this guy was like, listen, I'm an old Texas oil man. Do you mean to tell me that there's no one out there policing the cloud for us?" And I'm like, No, there's not. Actually, quite the opposite.
I'm from Texas. That was a pretty good Texas impersonation.
Oh, thank you.
Speaking of Texas, real quick, did you read about that? I'm not going to say their name, but that MSP, I believe it was last week. Was it last week or the week before? Something like that, that had all of their clients breached because of their MSP tools. And I think that they actually had to end up, and they were not able to recover. And because of that, they were able to get into all their client sites. I believe they lost backups, et cetera. And then they were able to, they actually had to send out a notice at one point saying, at this point, the chance of data recovery is very, very slim. I'm paraphrasing. And we would recommend you seek other technical advice or support someplace else. So basically, they're out of business.
Exactly. That's actually another good example of where the media contacted all of the techs on LinkedIn that were employed by that MSP, and they got one or two of them to disclose highly embarrassing confidential information, and the techs were just like, "Wow, cool, I'm on the news."
Yeah. I would add one more thing to this, and that is for that particular example, but I think it applies to everyone. It's not just losing the client. You could actually be sued. So, and that's kind of like, what's worse than being sued and having no revenue to pay the lawsuit?
But you're telling me, Dave, that we could actually approach all these companies proactively and show them what their current level of security is, what the risks are, let them know that there are some holes and a potential for breach, and give them the option to say yes or no.
Yes. And I'd actually, if I would take it one more step further, I would actually have them sign off in declining them.
I love that. Yes, a risk memorandum. Eric and Dave, we have a question, if I'd be able to throw that out there. So we've got a question from Jamie North, who says $25 per month per managed PC, that's going to be hard to justify. Customers are already paying monthly for management. So that's an add-on cost, not revenue, since most customers expect security already integrated. If I told my customers that we were going to increase their cost $25 per month per PC, there's the risk that I would lose them. Could you explain that logic a little further?
Yeah, definitely. So part of this process is doing an honest assessment with the client, showing them which security controls they do or don't have in place. It's important that they know what they are and are not paying for, so they don't assume that you're in charge of security that you're not, and giving them the option. And what we've found with the MSPs that we work with is that there's going to be like 5 to 10% of your top clients, you know who they are, your biggest, most important clients, they're actually willing to pay a lot more than $25 a month. They're willing to pay up to $75 a month per user for a full managed security program that looks like this, with a virtual chief information security officer, a virtual information security manager, pro services teams implementing security controls like Dave was talking about, and a red team that's doing simulated cyber attacks, penetration testing on a regular basis, and a SOC. A lot of what we talked about today was stuff that the SOC does, specifically in SOC. And there's going to be some number of clients that are actually willing to do everything, 5 to 10%, around 80% that are willing to do something like at least the bare minimum. And those costs to your MSP can get down to well below $10 a month per user. And the $25 a month figure is just a recommended MSRP. We see a lot of SOC competitors out there charging $25 a month per user for their packages that are half of what we're offering. So there's definitely a market for it. And you might have 10% or more that just go, you know what, thank you for educating me. Thank you for letting me know what we don't have. but I just don't want to spend any money on security right now. And like Dave said, what you've done is transferred the risk to them. You've gotten them to take accountability for their own risk.
All right. I would add something to that. So one is part of it is you're going to need to educate your clients. And I'm just basically kind of repeating what Eric said, but you need to educate your clients on the important, you want to educate your clients on the importance of, sorry, my other phone's ringing, it's distracted me. You need to educate your clients on how the world has changed from a security perspective, and you need to also educate them, like Eric said, is, here's what you're currently paying for. This does not include, now there's new threats out there that were not previously addressed. And so in order to be able to address that, we're going to have to be able to we need new tools, and we don't have the ability to do that. When you work with us, one of the things that we can do is we can counsel you and help you on how to sell this to your clients.
Yep. And by the way, these questions right here that we asked about the RMM and PSA tools, you can flip these around and ask a lawyer, what happens if somebody logs into your case management system from Russia? How would you know? What would happen if they phished your email password or your case management system password?
Right. One last thing, just to be concrete in the answer, that $25, like Eric said, that was like what we see a lot of our MSPs sell these services for, but it could be as low as, you could sell it for as low as $10 a month and still make a very healthy margin.
Yeah, you can sell it for $8 and make a small margin. I mean, the big thing that we see is that there is a revenue opportunity inside of every MSP. Some have a larger opportunity than others just based on the types of clients that they work with. But one of the biggest opportunities here is to know your risk, address your risk internally for a very small cost, and educate your clients on their risk so you're at least not held accountable if they get breached. And I think that's huge. Does that help answer the question, Ms. Hannah?
That's perfect. Thank you.
And I see that we're getting close to the, we have like 10 to 12 minutes left. Do we have any additional questions?
We do have another one. I know that you've spoken a lot about employee error within the MSP, which has caused a lot of cyber threats. What would be the first steps that you would take in order to train your employees to the level of threat, and what processes can you put in place to be able to prevent that?
That is a great question. How we approach that with MSPs has been to have that initial 1-hour security policy workshop. Let's define what's authorized. Let's get the very basics written down. Let's scan the environment and see what unauthorized activity is happening, because now we've taken the time to define the 25 things that are allowed. Now we can easily see what is unallowed that's going on, and we can educate the employees on that. Some of our more mature MSPs have a formal written policy. They train their team and have them sign a security policy compliance agreement. And once an employee is trained on the security policy and signs a written agreement not to do X, Y, and Z, it becomes a lot more real than before, when they just kind of had the admin password and nobody was asking and they didn't have to think twice before doing something. One thing that we commonly see with these MSPs is that when they have people doing stuff that is not safe, like a couple months ago, we had an MSP that was moving, they had like 40 users. They were moving everybody to Office 365, and their lead engineer was troubleshooting something, and for some reason, he opened up the remote desktop port and forwarded it to the Exchange server. It took exactly 14 minutes before we saw that the open remote desktop port was getting hammered with failed logins that had been discovered by a cyber criminal. During the troubleshooting, the MSP engineer disabled all of the IP geofiltering, so it was getting attacked from the entire world. And we were able to notify them, stop any breach from happening, and man, was the owner upset. But education is key, and making sure that the employees see this level of detail. I don't think we have a screenshot, but there's a really cool SOC dashboard that we give our MSPs, and a lot of them put that up in their help desk. So it's a constant daily reminder of who might be attacking them, and everybody can see if somebody starts an attack, whether it's a reconnaissance scan or sniffing for passwords or a brute force attack, whatever it is, visibility and education are key.
And verification. So you want to educate your employees. Of course, you probably have great employees. You want to trust them, but you need to verify that people just do things because it makes their job easier, and you want to make sure that's not creating a problem.
And if it does, you want to know about that problem immediately.
So, what other, yeah, Hannah, do we have any additional questions we haven't already covered?
So we do have another one. So when we've talked about the RMM and PSA, obviously there's the rock beds of people's practices. How do you evaluate the current risk around those tools, and how do you evaluate the security of the current tool set in-house to be able to prevent them?
Oh my God, did you pay somebody to ask that? The Center for Internet Security, by the way, Dave and I are both members of the U.S. Center for Internet Security. We have an assessment that is issued by the Center for Internet Security that we conduct. We will actually teach MSPs how to conduct this same assessment, but we start with doing one internally on the MSP. And that gives us a 0 to 5 score, so we can actually figure out how mature the MSP is. The average score is a 0.75 on a 0 to 10 or 0 to 5 scale, so that's obviously very bad. But what we do is we take a look at where all these different systems are hosted, where the data is hosted, and then we work on making sure that we can identify everything that's going on that we talked about. That's all done in the onboarding process, and after we define what's allowed and where everything is stored, then on the next call, we do these weekly calls. On the next call, we show them the results, and we immediately know where the biggest risks are. All those vulnerabilities are scored from 0 to 10, so we can approach the critical vulnerabilities first. And if we see that real cyber criminals are attacking open ports, we can squash those immediately day one, not wait. But because we see all this traffic, we know where every data packet is going to and coming from, and we have a deeper level of visibility, and we're looking at it through a security lens instead of an IT lens. So that's part of our onboarding process, hardening and securing your MSP.
One more thing with respect to those tools, we often hear the question, oh, is this a good tool or is that a bad tool? And the answer is, it depends. It's always going to be on how you configure it, and that's going to come up during your onboarding process, because that's where we're going to find out how you've got something configured, or how you're going to find out also how something's configured and whether or not it's going to be adding or subtracting from that score.
Yeah, I mean, those basic security questions that we asked earlier, you should turn around and ask every one of your vendors that, especially if they have access to your systems, or if you're hosting your data in their cloud. You need to know, hey, Mr. Company who's hosting my data, how would you know if the cyber criminal logged in as me? How would I know? Can I get alerted? And what you may find is that not all MSP vendors are created equal. And someday, I think that all the major vendors will have these security controls in place, but today they don't. And you should at least know which ones do and don't.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. We only have a few minutes left of the webinar. So if anyone does have any other questions, then feel free to ping them across to me and we'll be more than happy to answer them for you. But Eric and Dave, did you have any points that you'd like to wrap the webinar up on?
I'll just mention a couple. Know what your risk is. A lot of this is about answering those questions. That kind of gives us a starting point and lets us know if there is a risk and how large it is. And this is something that not only goes to protecting your MSP, but there's an opportunity to monetize it. And and Dave can probably talk more about this, so can Miles. I wouldn't be too scared about talking to your clients about security. We found that it's much better to let them know what level of security they're paying for with the agreements and what they're not paying for and what's available so that they can decide what they want to do and not hold you accountable for a potential breach in the future.
If you don't, excuse me, if you don't address this with them, then they have already created expectations in their head about what they think you're doing, and you're not doing that. You're not going to meet those expectations, and so that's going to put you at risk. So the worst thing you can do is not talk to your clients about it, I think, and the best thing to do is to say, go out and talk to them, educate them. The world has changed. Yep. I need these additional tools, and this is what we can do, and this is what you get out of it. And they either say yes or no, but even if they say no, if someone else comes along and brings it up to them, they can go, oh, well, my MSP offers that. I can go back and talk to them about it. So the worst thing you can do, I think, is to say nothing.
Totally agree. And to add to that point, there are other MSPs that are already starting to do this. There are some that have gotten fairly mature. And there are MSSPs that have been around for 20, 30 plus years that are coming down market, and they will be talking to some of your clients at some point.
Perfect. Guys, we do have one last minute question in the last 5 minutes from Jason, who says, it sounds like a lot of the scans are done on network, but as an MSP, most of our systems are entirely in the cloud, RMM, PSA, CMDB, Office 365. How does InStock scan these environments? A network vulnerability or packet scanner would typically look on a network.
So we have APIs that can connect to anything, but wherever these environments are being hosted, like Office 365, Azure, AWS, whatever, all of these environments actually have the ability to generate security logs and syslogs and things like that. Typically, either no one's looking at them or listening to them, or if they are, I mean, we're talking about billions of logs a week, so there's a lot of noise. What we do at InStock is we ingest all of those logs from the cloud providers, and we use our artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities to quickly analyze them and tell us, hey, these are the top alerts because we can see that someone's logged in 2 places at once, or this is a known cyber criminal IP. We have uplinks to real-time databases on known cyber criminal IP addresses, which change every day, every hour. So we ingest those logs, and we use them to correlate with other things that are going on, like, let's say, Ms. Hannah, where your cell phone is synchronizing to Microsoft 365 versus where you're logged in from on the computer. If your cell phone is synchronizing in London, and then you log in from a computer in China, that's probably, and it happens within 5 minutes, that's an impossible travel distance, and that's potentially a breach. That's how we get alerted.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. So we are now in the last 2 minutes of the webinar. So Eric, if you could go onto the last slide. We are offering a free PSA and RMM vulnerability scan to the first 5 MSPs that are on the line. We do have quite a few of you guys. So if you'd like to inquire about this, then feel free to email me. That's my email address on the screen there. And you can also send me over any questions that you might have following today's webinar, and myself, Eric and Dave would be more than happy to help on those. So thank you guys for presenting that. That was really helpful. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Hannah. Cheers.
Thank you.